So much of a difference there, I guess. But I hope and trust that you had a great time with him last week. And we went on a trip. Oh boy. We saw some things. We drove many, many kilometers, and it was really, really good. The one thing that kind of threw me off amidst the planning that we had done is how much snow we would run into. And now, for those of you that are wiser than myself, would have been like, well, duh, Scott, I could have told you that if we had talked about this. Yes, okay, thank you. I'm glad that some of you know this part. But about 5 different times we ran into snow that kind of disrupted our plans. And we went south. There's no snow in the south, but there is snow up in the mountains, apparently, even if those mountains are in the south. So the first time that we ran into this was on our, I guess not our first day. And early on, we made, the driver, let's call it the driver, made many wrong turns along the way, including where I grew up. I don't remember those roads as well as I used to, I guess. All of a sudden, a couple miles, I'm like, I think this should look different by now. Yeah, we're on the wrong road. Whatever, let's figure it out. We knew where we were going. We had an end in mind, and we were going to get there. So on day 2, we were driving through the Black Hills and thought, let's go up the twisty road with the neat caves and the Black Hills. That'll be really neat. And we got a little ways up there, and then the road was closed because there's snow in the hills, and there's snow up there. So we turned around and went back another way, looked at the faces, and Mount Rushmore, didn't pay the money to go past the gate, kept going down the road. We made it all the way down to Colorado Springs, so we've had one issue with snow. We spent some time there and drove up the mountain in this one spot, Pikes Peak, really cool. If that sounds familiar, either you like Starbucks coffee and you're used to that, or you're familiar with some sort of racing and you understand what that might mean as well. So Pikes Peak, we drove up and called ahead of time because we want to go to the top of the mountain. They make donuts up there. And we called and they only had part of it open. Well, hummed and hawed, just snuck into the gate and went up, and we met snow. We could only go to mile 12. We couldn't go to the top of the mountain. 2 times, snow got in our way. The third time was a little more interesting because we wanted to continue on our route, and it involved going up over the mountains, west through Colorado into Utah eventually. And as we're on that road, it's a nice day, probably 12, 15 degrees, beautiful, windy, knew a storm was coming. As we start heading on our route, and the driver figured, let's take the scenic route. We don't want to go the interstate the whole way. Let's look at nice things. So we go the scenic route, and as we're getting a bit higher, the clouds are coming down. Maybe we were coming up to them. And you see vehicles coming that start to have snow on the grill. That should tell you a few things. But we had a hotel booked. We had the end in mind. We needed to get there, so we got to keep charging ahead. As we're going, eventually it starts snowing. That's no big deal. It's still above 0, right? Let's carry on. And eventually the snow's staying on the road, traffic's slowing down, and oh look, now it's actually getting icy and the temperature is dropping. And as we continued up on that road, eventually we got down to -10 and completely white out as we're following traffic. And you start to realize there's not a lot of minivans on the road up here, but a lot more Subarus and SUVs and things that have all-wheel drive. But, the driver had figured it would be summer, so let's put the summer tires on before we leave home. So we start behind this semi, and the vehicles with 4-wheel drive, they drive around the semi, and because the semi had slowed right down. We're still climbing. I can't afford to slow down. We got to keep moving. We need some momentum here. And realized that the semi hadn't stopped for any old reason. He had no more traction. He was sliding and slowly slipping to the edge of the road to the ditch, the mountainside, the good side, not the fall off the cliff side. And we were doing the same as we were trying to go and need to get around this guy and realize, oh, maybe the traction control isn't helping us. Let's turn that off, and we could finally get around him. At that point, you're starting to wonder, have we made some poor choices here? Should we turn around? But we had a hotel booked. We had the end in mind. We needed to get there. And so we continued on in the driver's poor choices, made it around the semi as we're climbing and climbing and climbing, and the snow and the ice is still there. Keep as much speed as we can. And you hear from somewhere deep in the van, I need to go to the washroom. Oh boy, this might be a bottle situation. Let's see what happens. But at that point, not so long, we'd crested the top of the mountain, and finally, it's still white out, but there was a spot to pull out where they could talk about the top of the mountain, and we saw the sign for 11,000 feet. That's why there's snow. And able to, take care of everything, continue on our way down, and we made it to our destination. We had the end in mind, and we were able to make it, press on through the difficulty, whether wise or not. We made it. That was the 3rd time we ran into snow. I think there were 5. Yeah. And we decided at one point, the driver decided that it would be a good idea to see Old Faithful. Like, let's go through Yellowstone, and this is historical. These are neat things, geological things. Let's go and see the smelly fart water that comes out of the hole every so many minutes. And so we headed on that way and figured let's go up through the park. And then this time, the driver looked ahead a little bit and found that, those roads aren't actually open. They don't open the roads in Yellowstone. They don't take care of those roads through the winter. They start plowing later in spring, so let's adjust plans. We had a hotel booked, so we had the end in mind. We had to get to that. Went and looked at the gate at Yellowstone, didn't see or smell any fart water, and then carried on our way. And then we were getting farther north. Things are getting a little more calm. We're in Montana now, and things should be pretty simple. We've encountered snow 4 times. There's a 5th time we got to land on yet, because we figured that why would we take the interstate up to Alberta? That's not fun. The driver decided we should take the scenic route. And so away we go on a really beautiful road that's next to the river and back and forth. And eventually the road starts climbing. And you realize the same situation again. The vehicle's coming towards you, have snow on the grill, and you're wondering what you're going to get yourselves into. This wasn't near as bad. Just ice and slush and beautiful fresh snow that anyone with skis or snowboard or snowmobile, as we saw at Truck and Trailer, would have just loved. We just put up with the ice and snow, went atop our 9,000-foot summit and descended down and did not see snow again, which we were grateful for. Grateful there was no snow back here when we arrived as well. But we pressed on because we, number one, had a hotel booked, so we got to get there. That's where we're staying for the night. We didn't want to adjust. We wanted to persevere through. We adjusted whatever plans we could to get to that point. But having that end in mind, boy, that sure drives you towards some stuff sometimes. Knowing where you're going, knowing what the final destination is going to be. And that's kind of sat with me a bit as we figure and consider where we're going to be going this morning and for the next number of weeks, looking into the book of 1 Peter. Because we're going to look at the character of Peter, because we really need that to look at 1 Peter. And man, oh man, was this a man with the end in mind. He knew where he was going. And whatever the route was going to take to get him there, he knew if he had to adjust or persevere through, he was willing to do that. But he had the end in mind. And I hope we can kind of see that this morning as we look through that. So 1 Peter is where we're going to be. We'll be here for a little while. Not just this morning. Through the coming weeks, we'll spend more time in 1 Peter. But this is where we're going. 1 Peter. You can turn there. Hebrews, James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John is where it lands itself in the New Testament. 1 Peter, this is how it starts. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. To God's... Actually, we probably need to pause right there already. Because Peter... the more we know about Peter, the more this letter, I think, has color to it instead of just black and white. And what a character. Peter is so remarkable. We know he's the apostle of Jesus Christ. We see that here. How about we just look a little bit, let me give you, we don't need to look too deeply, let me give you a little bit of background of this man named Peter. The trajectory of Peter's life is pretty remarkable because we get to see him from early on. And Peter has a wonderful story. I love that he's not perfect because it gives, I think, hope to the rest of us when we make poor decisions or get things a little bit wrong. But Peter, Simon Peter, as he's sometimes called, is a very ordinary man. He completed his early years of education in the Torah, and then he went working. He was married. We know that because of one of the disciples. He had a wife. And so he was a married man, getting on with life. He was a fisherman, ordinary and unschooled in the sense of he didn't continue on. He didn't do higher education, we could say. And we see that example from when he's in he's in front of the Sanhedrin, and they're questioning him, and the Sanhedrin's words. It's Acts 4:13, if you want to follow up on that story later on. But they're questioning Peter and John, and their words are, they recognize that they were unschooled, ordinary men. And sometimes we might see that as a slam, but what a wonderful characteristic to have. Unschooled, ordinary men, and God using them absolutely remarkably. So this ordinary man who was married, who was working as a fisherman, getting on with life in an ordinary way. And then Jesus happens on the scene. And Jesus knows something deeper that is there, knows a deeper call that is on Simon's life. And he extends that call at the very beginning as he calls his disciples and he calls Simon. And this is so fantastic as well, because he calls them, come follow me. He says, and your name is Simon, and you will be called, well, then it's different. Cephas, Hebrew way, or Petros, closer to rock in the Greek is what it comes to as well. And he says, your name will be Peter. And wouldn't that be so interesting if we operated that way as disciples of a rabbi and someone calling you to follow? And just like straight out of the gate, it's like, this is who you are, and you will be called this. It's like, well, I've been Simon my whole life. What's wrong with that? It's a good name. Can't we stick with that one? Changes his name to Peter. And he doesn't give him all the rationale right away. Calls him Peter, and then gives him, throughout his lifetime, the definition of that call. So he names him Peter, and then he lives into that call as the years go by. You shall be called Peter. And maybe there's one part let's look at in Matthew that kind of describes maybe a little bit more of these bits here. Matthew chapter 16. Before we continue on in Peter. Matthew chapter 16. Verses 16 to 19. And this is Jesus kind of giving his meaning to the call that he had given to Peter already. And now, this is kind of the middle. This is often the peak of these Gospels where the disciples finally recognize that Jesus is God. They piece that together. So verse 16 of chapter 16. Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus replied to him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but my Father in heaven. This calling on Simon's life as Peter was from the beginning. God built into him when he knew him. He built this into him and called him. And I tell you, verse 18, that you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. This isn't the first time he's calling him Peter. He had called him Peter early on when he called him, but he's just reaffirming it to him. You are Peter. Don't forget this. You are the rock. Not that rock, the rock. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Wow. This is Peter. This is the call that was on his life. This is the authority that Jesus gave to him. And this part, too, of kind of the giving the keys of the kingdom, there's some imagery we lose there, again, because we're not first century Jews. Difficult for us. But a bit of this kind of like giving him the reins. Like, you're going to be in charge. You get to make the call. And what you make the call on will be lasting. The way, in a similar language, when we think of the Lord's Prayer, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And Peter is given a little bit of a piece of that. What you bind on heaven and earth will be bound in heaven. This is, you're given the authority. And we see him using those keys to open up the doors to the rest of the world. Because Peter is present at Pentecost when the Holy Spirit comes and he preaches, and people from many different languages understand the message of the gospel that he preaches at that time. And then he does this again when he has a vision and he goes to the Gentiles and he opens up the door again. He uses these keys and opens up the doors to the Gentiles in a similar experience. That it's not just the Jews that get to have Jesus. It is all of humanity. It is all people. He opens them up to Samaria as well before that, and then the Gentiles as well. Those stories show up in Acts 2, 8, and 10. This is Peter. He walked with Jesus. He made mistakes in walking with Jesus, and he was told that he would deny Jesus 3 times. He did that, and we don't see any big mistakes, any big fallings away like that in his life later on. Confronted with mistakes later on as well, but steady on as he goes. Peter lives into that calling of being the rock. He had spent time with Jesus. He knew what Jesus was like, And he knew when Jesus left where he was going to be going as well. He had the end in mind. He knew what it would be like to be with Jesus again for eternity one day. He knew that that was the end. That was the day. That was the end that we were driving towards. So Peter, as we see in the Gospels, he's this very aggressive character. He's got a big personality. He's not afraid to open his mouth and say whatever. He's not afraid to get into the mix of things. He's not afraid to be part of what might be a rebellion against the Romans. He's like, I'm with you, Jesus. Let's do this. And Jesus had different plans for him. Let's not be cutting ears off. This is a different way that we're going to follow. So he's an aggressive leader. But the disciples, they see him as an equal. Like he's the hothead perhaps that they might have recognized, but they're still arguing who's the greatest. So they don't think he's the greatest because they think they could be. Anyways, as we carry on, we see that he makes some mistakes, but he actually has this one. And just this little story. You go read it other time. It's the beginning of Galatians because him and Paul have a bit of a confrontation, where Peter had gone to the Gentiles. He had opened the gate. He had opened the doors for the Gentiles already, and had this point where he was with the Gentiles, and then the Jews were coming and being in that area as well. And so he kind of pulled back from eating with the Gentiles, and there was some hypocrisy happening there. And Paul addresses it. It's in Galatians 2:11-14. We're not going to read it this time, but you can go look at it. Paul rebukes him for what? He's like, that wasn't right, man. You can't be doing that. That's this double standard. That can't exist. It's either Gentiles all in or not. And we know that they're all in. And so Paul rebukes him, and he's like, yeah, you're right, and sorts things out. So kind of interesting how he's still willing to learn, but still making some of those mistakes along the way, even when he is living into his calling as Peter, as Petros, as the rock. This is Peter. And now if Peter was a superhero, which I'm sure he wouldn't say, we get to look at his whole story and like, man, he seems like a superhero. The sort of things that he does, his faith, his willingness to follow through on things, even after he had made mistakes, he does continue on. But if he was a superhero, I have an idea who I think he would be. But let me point out a couple things and see if you can think of, well, I don't care what you think. Actually, no, I do. But see if you can think the same way I'm thinking. This is ridiculous. Anyways, if he was a superhero, here's this guy who's pretty brash. He's in your face, he's aggressive, but boy, is he a strong leader. He's willing to go the extra mile. He's willing to stick by no matter what. He's willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice, because that's how the end of Peter's life. He didn't die of old age. He was killed for his faith at the end of it. So he's bold, he's visionary. He sees like, this is what could be. Come on, Jesus, let's get on. Let's move the kingdom. Let's move it in this way. And Jesus corrects him. But he is willing to see like this can go beyond what just the Jews have, as he opened the gate for the Gentiles. So here's a guy who's a leader, visionary. He's very public. He's impulsive. Who do you think he is? I think he sounds a lot. Oh, and here's another fun little one. And he ends up having a conflict with another primary leader, which is a whole movie of one, which is kind of fun to see as well. And they kind of maybe not part ways, but they have a conflict there as well. But he grows in maturity. And this is one part that's really neat with Peter. We see where he starts from, and we see how he grows to like, oh man, at the beginning, I don't know if Peter would have been willing to pay the cost in the beginning of his life. We see that he denied Jesus 3 times, so perhaps not willing to sacrifice at that point. But by the end of his life, as he grew into maturity and faith and telling others about Jesus, oh, he is so willing to pay the cost. Sounds a lot like a Tony Stark to me. Looks a lot like an Iron Man to Paul's Captain America, perhaps. It's really interesting how many of those strengths you see come out in that, as I've been thinking about that in that way. There's a lot of superhero looking there. I'm sure they would tell us is not a superhero. Anyways, this is Peter. And with this Peter, and we can kind of understand the letter that he wrote, it gives us a little more framework to understand what he's trying to convey, what he's trying to convince of the people that he's writing to. Because he has the end in mind. He knew Jesus as a physical human being beside him. And he knew that he was going to be with Jesus one day as well. And so with that end in mind, it influences a lot of what he writes, and how he writes and the things he writes. Even just the arguments he'll have he'll have these phrases in there, so that, with the end in mind. Like he's pointing to, like, if this is where we're going, then this is how we ought to live. This is how we ought to be right now. He has this eschatological mindset, the end in mind, knowing that Jesus is coming back. And with that in mind, we have 1 Peter. So we didn't get very far the first time. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. Okay, we know who Peter is. We have an idea of what he is like. And this letter is actually written kind of near the end of his life, probably around AD 64, which, for background, this time in Rome, he likely wrote it from Rome, was not a pleasant time to be a Christian in Rome. Nero was emperor. There had been this grand fire in Rome, and Nero blamed the Christians for it because he needed a scapegoat. That seemed like they're kind of an obscure little cult. Let's blame them. And many Christians were persecuted and killed under the hand of Nero during this time. Many others fled Rome as well. And it was not pleasant. They were not killed if you can kill anyone in a nice way, they were killed in terrible, terrible ways. Persecution had begun in Rome under Nero, but Peter was anticipating, as it would, that this was going to spread. It's not going to stay just in Rome. So then he writes, to God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. Grace and peace be yours in abundance. So from Rome, written to these people. Now, I have a few maps. I just want to give you a geographical landing point for this, for those that like maps. So the first one we have just kind of shows the grand, like this bigger area. So you can see Italy with the boot there kicking the ball. And then to the right, you see the Black Sea. And then on the next slide, you can see this is a square we're going to zoom in on. This is kind of the Asia Minor that Peter is writing to. So we'll go to the next one then, and this is kind of the area. So the Black Sea at the top, you can kind of seen that from the other map before. And these are the four areas that he's writing to. Pontus, you see that on the top. Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So this top slice, this top semicircle area of Asia Minor that Peter was writing to. And now, interestingly, these were probably areas that Paul didn't actually spend too much time in. Need to see how Peter and Paul, how their missionary ventures kind of work with each other. And so a bunch of these churches were, perhaps, we don't have it exactly to know for sure, that Peter, good chance, as he made his way to Rome, maybe planted some of these churches in these areas. So he's writing to these churches, not some of the areas that Paul writes to. There's some overlap, I get that. But by and large, this was more areas that Peter had been familiar with. Peter had perhaps relationship with these people. And this letter written to a large area, so like circle it around. It's not written to one person, one church. These people all in this area need to hear this, need to see this. So that's why he's writing to the elect, the exiles scattered throughout. And the wording he used here, God's elect, and the exiles, this dispersion, sometimes got referred to like the Jews who had been pushed away, the diaspora, these Jews that were scattered abroad. And Peter's kind of like accommodating the word and including the Gentiles in there as well. You can see those keys to the kingdom thing he's doing, where he's saying like it's for all Christians, it's for all people who follow Jesus. And so we see a few of those clues throughout God's elect, exiles, but then as he talks about foreigners as well, we'll see that later on. So this is who Peter is writing to, why he's writing, and who Peter is like. Whew, there we go. We got through verse 1 and 2. I'm not going to drag us through too much of 1 Peter more this morning, but I want to point out kind of the center of 1 Peter, holding in mind that he's operating with the end in mind. And he's and there's three big points that show up in 1 Peter. They're not linear because why would that make sense to write in a linear fashion? Let's chase it all throughout, which really gives you the opportunity when you read all of 1 Peter together to see these three things keep showing up. So he does these three themes, and they're mostly captured actually in a few verses. So in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 12, there's three things that he's going to point out in here. But you are a chosen people, a royal sinners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. On the day he visits us. He's always pointing towards this end in mind. With this end in mind, glorify God. With this end in mind, live such good lives that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. So there's three things that he's going to point out that are seen in here in this few verses, but also seen throughout the entire letter. And these three things are to suffer, because he was experiencing suffering in Rome, and he was anticipating that's coming. That's going to be coming your way. So be willing to suffer with the end in mind. Second is to live as resident foreigners, recognizing that you are like sometimes actually foreigners where you are because you've been dispersed perhaps, but to understand that you serve a different kingdom, you serve a different God, and so you are where you live a foreigner, a resident foreigner. So live as resident foreigners with the end in mind because you know where home is. You know where you're going one day. And thirdly, you are the people of God. Really lays that in to be able to help these Gentiles who perhaps felt on the outside from the Jews or separate other than, and now this is all together because of what Jesus has done. You are the people of God with the end in mind. Let me just point out in this section where those show up, if you didn't catch it on the first time through. In verse 9 to 10, this is the people of God one. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, now you are the people of God. It's the first one. The resident foreigners is in verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. That was number 2. Number 1, to suffer with the end in mind. We see in verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong. And now that's an interesting one right there, hey? We often think of suffering as maybe physical, perhaps like mental, social suffering, but it's just like though they accuse you of, though they're saying bad things about you, and Peter's like, yeah, that's suffering. Yeah, they wouldn't be saying that if it weren't for Jesus, so they are persecuting you in some way. That is an element of suffering. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds. Glorify God on the day he visits us. Having the end in mind. So those three things are what we're going to see throughout 1 Peter. And now 1 Peter is only 5 chapters long. And so my invitation to you over the next little while is to read 1 Peter in its entirety, in one sitting. I don't believe it'll take you too long. If it's easier to listen to, then use a Bible app and listen to it. And maybe do both. Maybe read it one day and listen to it the next day. And have those things in mind. What's Peter talking about? As towards the end, he's going to have this showing up. With the end in mind, it is for Peter. And you're going to see these things about being the people of God, being resident foreigners, and an invitation to suffering and to be able to stand up under that suffering. So that's my invitation or challenge to you as we go through this next week and onward, continuing on in 1 Peter. And my hope is that we will be encouraged and challenged by Peter's words, but also by Peter's life. Oh man, he walked with Jesus. He knew what Jesus was like. He saw firsthand the things that Jesus did. And he knew that Jesus was coming back. He saw him go, and he knew one day he's going to come back. And he knew that one day Peter himself would be with Jesus again. It's the invitation for us to operate in that as well, to have the end in mind. Because when we have the end in mind, we are so much more willing to push through difficulty, to persevere when we need to persevere. We're willing to adjust course if we need to in order to get around an obstacle, if we can't go through or over it. We're willing to put up with a lot more when we know what the end is. And we know what the end is. It's the same hope that Peter had, to be with Jesus again, to know that this is not our final destination where we are right now. And I so hope that we can live bold like Peter throughout this week, throughout each day, knowing that the end in mind is so good. And how can we live such good lives that others may know Jesus and glorify him, that others may know the forgiveness of Jesus as we know it as well. With that in mind, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your work through Peter. We look at him and can see that he looks to be a hero. But we know that he could do that only because of you. So, Holy Spirit, I pray that you would give us the insight to learn from Peter's example. Pray that you would refine our lives. Dear God, where we've gotten it wrong and we've sinned, we confess that to you, give that to you. Thank you for your graciousness to let us try again. Pray that you would give us a healthy sense of the end, knowing what our final destination is, knowing that's with you, Jesus. Thank you for paving the way for that we can have life through you and with you, starting right now, and knowing that it's only going to get better one day as well. Pray that you would give us the ability to persevere through difficulty in that, and whatever comes our way, knowing that you are with us, you will never leave us, you will never forsake us. Lead us on, God, as we attempt to be your people here in Elm Creek and this surrounding area. We pray this all in your name, Jesus. Amen.